Muy buenos días a todos, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta segunda edición de las jornadas educativas que celebra el Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico en colaboración con el Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños. Me acompaña en esta ocasión Raquel Torre Arzola del Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico, a quien le cedo la palabra.
Saludos Ángel, buenos días, bienvenidas, bienvenidos y bienvenidas todos también a esta segunda edición de la Jornada de Alta Investigación y Creación Multidisciplinaria del Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico este año, como dijo muy bien Ángel Antonio, en una estupenda colaboración con el Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños de Hunter College en Nueva York. Queremos agradecer a todo el personal que está a cargo del aspecto técnico, queremos agradecer a todos los panelistas, a los moderadores y a quienes han estado trabajando en la organización de este evento. Muchísimas gracias. Ángel, ¿quisieras conectarte? Ángel, director del Centro de Arte y Cultura del Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños. Para esta edición, titulada Desaprender Arte y Pedagogía Creativa, hemos dedicado las jornadas al estudio amplio de las relaciones entre arte y educación. Y pues voy a repasarles brevemente un poco el itinerario para hoy. Ahora a las 11 de la mañana tenemos una conferencia inaugural con el artista Juan Sánchez. A la 1 de la tarde tendremos el panel Creando desde Cero. Y a las 4 de la tarde tendremos un panel titulado Paisaje y Soberanía. Así que les dejo con Ángel Antonio para que presente al conferenciante, a la moderadora y pues obviamente que deje con ustedes las tareas. Adelante, Ángel.
Ok, muy bien, pues en el día de hoy, como dijo Raquel, tenemos la suerte de que nos acompañe el maestro Juan Sánchez, pero como moderadora para este panel, y quien lo va a presentar, tenemos el lujo de tener a Yarimar Bonilla, directora del Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños acá en Hunter, y quien va a hacer la introducción de Juan. El panel va a correr de la siguiente forma. Juan va a tener una presentación. Luego de la presentación va a entrar en una dinámica de preguntas y respuestas con Yarimar, y luego de eso vamos a tener unos minutos para preguntas con el público. Así que sin más, les dejo con Yarimar Bonilla, a quien ya todos conocen, y que disfruten muchísimo la presentación de Juan, que sabemos que lo van a hacer.
Thank you, Angel. I'm going to speak in English. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be in dialogue with Juan Sánchez and to be able to introduce him. On a personal note, I wanted to say that Juan was one of the first NeoRican, diasporican artists that came into my consciousness and really, for me, defined what diasporican art is. And even diasporican sensibility. I remember running into his art pieces when I was a young student and being so moved by it and so pulled to learn more about him and his experience. So I'm so grateful to him for this opportunity. Juan Sánchez is a painter, photographer, printmaker, and video artist, born to immigrant working class Puerto Rican parents in Brooklyn, New York. He is part of a generation of artists such as Coco Fusco, Guillermo Gómez Peña, Pepón Osorio, and Papo Colo, who in the 1980s and 90s explored questions of ethnic, racial, and national identity in their work. Among numerous group exhibitions in national and international gallery and museum venues, Sánchez had solo exhibitions at Break Arts, Media House, PS1, MoMA Contemporary Art Center, El Museo del Barrio, Exit Art, Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Fifth Havana Bienal, and el Museo de Historia, Antropología y Arte, la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Among several permanent collections, his art is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, El Museo del Barrio, and the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. Sánchez has been awarded grants and fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, New York Foundation for the Arts, the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Sánchez earned a BFA from the Cooper Union School of Art and an MFA from the Mason Gross School of the Arts of Rutgers University, and we are very proud to have him as a professor of art at Hunter College in New York City. With that, I will turn it over to Juan, who will give some opening remarks, and then we will have a dialogue and incorporate questions from the audience. Along the way, as Juan is speaking, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box so that I can see them and bring them to his attention. And with that, I turn over to you, Juan.
Yarimar, thank you. That's quite a long introduction, but I'm very happy. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. And I'm here to share a little bit about my art and enter into a dialogue with all of you. And just to add to the background, and please excuse me, I may be going back and forth between Spanish and English, but basically I'm a native Brooklynite. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My parents immigrated from Puerto Rico in the early 50s and situated themselves in New York, particularly in Brooklyn. And I lived most of my life in Williamsburg and Bushwick and Brownsville. I'm presently in Williamsburg. And I would like to start with the PowerPoint presentation. And let me just zoom to the very beginning because it'll give you a much visual background in terms of what's going on. So what you see flashing is what's going to come afterwards. But I need to start by reading this text because the reality of it is, like in the case of Puerto Rico, colonialism started with the invasion of Europe and the United States, among other countries, and the impact of that had been very strong, especially to our indigenous people. And joining you today from the unceded land of the Museo, Lecpate, and Canarsie peoples, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Museo, Lecpate, and Canarsie community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. I wish to acknowledge that the United States of America was founded upon exclusion and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located in New York and the state of New York. As a descendant of the Caribbean island of Borinquen, I also wish to acknowledge the Bonicu Taino nation who are still enduring and struggling against foreign colonial occupation. Let's acknowledge them as we acknowledge all indigenous nations of the Americas, our own ancestors, and their shared history of colonialism, slavery, and genocide. I also would like to dedicate my presentation to two people that came into my life and meant a lot and has had an incredible impact with their art. And unfortunately, they passed away. One is Hiram Maristani, who passed away on March 10th of this year. And the other one is Hector Tito Matos, our plenero, our bombero, coming out of Puerto Rico, living in New York for many years. That's when we met and we collaborated on a number of projects together. I even designed one of his CD albums a few years ago. So I would like to dedicate my talk to these two giants that unfortunately are not here with us. So anyway, I titled this presentation AmeRican, and underneath reconstructions. And what you see on as an image is a mixed media print titled "Colonialism is the Real AIDS." And this piece was done back in 1990. And throughout many of the artwork that I'll be showing you, you're gonna see this individual, be it male or female, whose identity is covered by the Puerto Rican flag. And this image originally started as a drawing, as a campaign for the release of the 11 Puerto Rican political prisoners. President Clinton later pardoned them. But this image evolved to become something much more expansive. Not only did it once represent Puerto Rican political prisoners, but it also represents the island of Puerto Rico. It represents the Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States. It represents us. And it's an image that has been perpetuating throughout many of my works, as you will see. But the title Reconstruction came out of a Ray Barretto album, which is one of my favorite Ray Barretto albums. After this one, he also recreated a bunch of Latin jazz albums, which I love very much. But when I came across this album, the music was amazing, is amazing. But when I came across that title, Reconstruction, it just blew my mind. And I have to admit that this influenced the title of the Reconstruction series, and it expanded what this word really means. I mean, it's a play of the word Reconstruction, and he put Rican in front of it. But in an interview, which I read many years ago, he was asked about that title, and he just talked about who we are as a people, as a culture, what we have contributed on so many levels, how we kind of like deconstructed our colonized history and recreated this entity, this culture that breaks down that colonization. We are manifesting ourselves. We are a new voice, and we are manifesting on so many living, in so many areas, like music, like art, like politics, you know, social justice, so on and so forth. And he just put it in a very small nutshell. That was enough for me to say, you know what, this is what I've been doing with my work since I was in art school. This is what I've been doing, you know? And I thank him for coming up with that word. And I also thank him for all the wonderful music that he has created. And then I came across that I was always reading and still reading Puerto Rican poetry, Latin American poetry, African American poetry, Native American poetry. I love poetry, but the poetry that really hit home for me very early in the 70s, the NeoRican poetry, and the opening of the NeoRican Poets Cafe, where I got introduced to many poets, among them the great Tato Laviera. And he came out with several books, but this one, AmeRican, really hit me again because of the title, you know, and it speaks about the experience of the Puerto Rican, the NeoRican in New York, in the United States. It comes from his own vantage point, very Afrocentric. His poetry is almost like music to the rhythm of bomba and plena. When he delivered his poetry, it had that musicality to it. It had that movement. You almost feel as if you could hear the bomba drums behind him. And when he came up with this title, I said, you know what? Just like Reconstruction, that's me too. And so I took on that word and I identify with it. And to me, these two words really represent the Puerto Rican diaspora, but it also represents the people, the Boricuas living in Puerto Rico, because of the colonized situation where we do have a second-class citizenship. And, you know, as the saying goes, we're neither here or there. And, you know, the people in the island don't have the right to vote, but the island is totally controlled economically and everything else by the United States. we're all Americans, so to speak. Mostly, we are all AmeRicans. I just wanted to throw a bunch of covers for you because there's so many books that I have read and continue to read that has opened up my mind beyond just the question of my NeoRican Boricua identity and the situation that we exist. And you know, to read Frantz Fanon, The Wretch of the Earth, among others, and The Colonized and the Colonizer, and also, you know, which what I consider my first Bible, Perry Thomas, Down This Mean Street, and Pedro Petri's Puerto Rican Obituary, and I could go on and on and on. You know, Angela Davis, Marie Baraka, Assata Shakur, the Young Lords, Malcolm X. I mean, these are people that has educated me and opened up my mind and created this thing about being in solidarity with people in struggle. And the same thing is true with the music. You know, I mean, there's Eddie Palmieri, there's Ray Barreto, there's Tito Puente, there's John Coltrane, there's Billie Holiday, you know, Rosanne Roland Kirk, Celia Cruz, La Lupe, Ismael Rivera, and on and on and on. So living in New York and being exposed to all of this richness, you know, those are the things that makes me who I am, including the environment in which I'm living in, the environment, the neighborhoods that I lived in and continue to live in. And as a photographer back in the 70s and the 80s, just documenting the graffitis and the walls in Williamsburg, in El Barrio, of Puerto Rican pride, Puerto Rican expression, the reality of Puerto Rico fighting for self-determination. I would just be walking with the camera, and whenever I saw anything related to who we are, those are the things that also is part of our environment. Those are the things that kept reminding me as to who we are. You know, this is like a public expression from the people, and I took all of that in. And from there, all those Puerto Rican flags, all those graffiti, all those slogans, I was also a part of it. I used to go out and design posters for the release of the 5 nationalists and later for the 11 Puerto Rican prisoners of war. And I would design these posters, and I would go out with my comrades to paste these posters out in the street and spray paint slogans. And that was done in the wee hours of the night, very late in the evening. There's always 1 or 2 keeping watch for the cops. But again, walking through the neighborhoods and finding these Puerto Rican flags, even painted at the door of abandoned buildings and so on and so forth, made me think, you know what? What would happen if I was to explore and use all of what I'm learning from the streets and apply it into my own work, into my painting? And so this is what has resulted. The spray painting, the repetition of photographic images, for the most part my own, the incorporation of a poster that I designed, Donde está mi casa, donde está mi país, para donde o por donde vamos, and utilize different techniques like oil paint and oil pastels and spray paint and create these multi-layer collages that communicates on many different levels to make various statements. The upside down palm tree, which is very prevalent throughout many of my work, also represents Puerto Rico floating in limbo. Puerto Rico either not being there or here, you know, it's upside down. So it also takes on other references, but the palm tree is very popular iconography in tourist brochure and so on and so forth. Very romantic image with the sunset in the background. I inverted it, I turned it into something else. And so again, even dealing with Taino roots, Taino petroglyph, the caves, and graffiti out in the street. I try to bring those two together in an urban environment. And so through these petroglyphs, you see the graffiti spray painting and so on and so forth. And one day I was in the subway and I saw this young guy with a Puerto Rican flag on his arm. This was back in 79. And of course, since then, there's been like hundreds of thousands of us with Puerto Rican flag tattoos on our body. But this guy was a young Marine that was on leave, and he was there with his younger brother in the subway, and I had the courage to ask him if I could shoot pictures of him, and this is what I captured. Arizo Campo, just like Malcolm X, has had an incredible impression on me. And a revolutionary, a devout Catholic, we all know who he is, what he went through. I decided to create this mixed media print, an iconic image of Pedro Arizo Campo centered in the composition. The spirals floating throughout a backdrop of his portrait repeatedly, and the Sacred Heart of Christ. I literally turned Pedro Arizo Campos into an icon. This is another print to honor great poet, activist, feminist, Julia de Burgos, whose portrait I really love and appreciate. We all know about her life and the tragic end of her life, but she is one of our most celebrated poets, not only in Puerto Rico, but in Latin America. The Puerto Rican Young Lords Party has also had an incredible impact, especially during the time that I was in high school. And there were a couple of individuals that were distributing the Palante newspaper in the campus. And there was one that would always give me a free copy. I learned from the Palante newspaper, and I learned about my connection in terms of my Taino, my African, and my Spanish roots. And I learned from the Young Lords to be in solidarity with people in struggle. At that time, it was the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese, and on and on and on. And I decided that this print, which also has Taino petroglyph, but if you look at it from an angle, it also had all kinds of signs coming out of African religion and culture. And I did with a transparent gloss on top of all of that. So you could only see it at a certain angle. And of course, this wonderful photograph by Michael Abramson, portrait of members of the Young Lords. And then again, going back to the idea of what I call el Boricua desconocido, the unknown Boricua, I did a series of works on paper using that as a backdrop and then laying other layers on top of it. So this is like a detail, on the right is a detail shot of the collage that I first start with. And then on the left is one of the finished works. There's one titled Red, White, and Blue. This one is devoted to my mother, Carmen Maria Colón. This is one of several artwork that I have created throughout the 80s. And most recently, this piece from 2013 titled Poema para Mami, Missing You. I use text that goes back and forth between English and Spanish. Sometimes it ends up being Spanglish, but the text here really talk about who she was to me, and in terms of her character and the lessons that I've learned, her example, and the fact that even though she passed away in 1987, I still have this void. I still have this emptiness. I miss her. And the photograph of her feet in her chancleta, standing firmly on the dirt ground, speaks to who she is, and speaks to all of our mothers who have sacrificed themselves on so many levels. In the case of my mother, as a single mother, because my father left when I was about 12 years old. And this is a detailed shot from the composition. The Virgin of Perpetual Sorrow, which used to be on her bedpost. And I inherited that and I used it in the collage. Lace, pieces of lace, collie shells, always pointing to and identify to our Afro culture. This one is a piece on my wife, Alma, Love for Someone Still Searching. This is a piece titled Niña Vigilanta. I use my daughter as a model for this photograph. Again, speaking to our Afro Boricua culture. This is an image that I've been using in the last 10, 15 years and in a whole new series of paintings called Cries and Wounded Whispers. And it's an image of the face of a baby that's crying, and I kind of like mirrored it and inverted it. So it became like a circular mandala of sorts. And depending on the painting, I would put the Sacred Heart of Christ or the red stained stigmata. Depending on what I'm addressing, the middle section has a different kind of image. But focusing in on the face of a crying baby and creating this mandala-like symbol speaks to the cries that we hear from people struggling. It speaks of the angst. It speaks of the pain. It speaks of the rebellion. It's a cry that you could hear, and oftentimes hear maybe from a distance, or not hear at all. Cries that we do not hear. And that's why it's titled Cries and Wounded Whispers, because the wound is still open, and it's a way of expression and saying, how are we going to heal from the impact, from the trauma of slavery and colonialism and genocide. And so I started with this painting from 2003 titled Lindo Rayos, Lindo Colores, which speaks to the incarceration of Pedro Isocampo and the fact that his cell was radiated. And he was complaining that something was going on in his cell and people didn't believe him. He would say that he would, in the night, he would see like these floating, colors in the air. And of course, he was marked as this person who was going crazy. Years later, I would say maybe like 15, 20 years later, the New York Times came out with a report of how the United States was using radiation as a weapon. And many people like Alviso, including the Black segregated section of the army, were used as guinea pigs to try these things out. And of course, you see Pedro, who was later released with all these burnt all over his body, and he was showing to the photographer the result of the radiation burns. The cry, which is above the photograph, is there. This one para Ángel Cristóbal Rodriguez, who was assassinated in Tallahassee prison. Very strong, young activist from the Puerto Rican Socialist League. He was arrested in Vieques along with a number of other activists. And they were given a prison term like 5 months or so, and a penalty. But he was the only one that was transported to Tallahassee prison. All the rest served their time in Puerto Rico. And he was a young man, 33, with a family, had a farm in Vieques. He was a friend. We participated in many organizations of marches and conferences together. And I get a phone call and to tell me that he was found hung in his cell. He never drank, he never smoked. His body was beaten. He had needle marks on his arms. He never used drugs. It was very obvious that they killed him. This one is on Malcolm X. The thing about the Cries and Wounded Whisper series is that I use photograph, a post-mortem photograph of people that I admired and people that I consider my heroes. In my earlier paintings, I used to use these photographs of them leading a march or being on the podium, talking to the crowd and things like that. They're very heroic images, but I decided to use post-mortem images just to make it clear to us that they were killed, that they died in the struggle. And it's very disalarming, but I think that I wanted to get the point across because I felt the enemy, the emotion, of these events that I consider part of my history as well. This one speaks to lynching of Black and Mexicans and Chinese in the United States. But the real emphasis is on the lynching of Blacks and I used the text from the song Strange Fruit, which Billie Holiday recorded. And images of lynch men and women is collaged within the green area, the cross area. The American flag, the opposite colors, the negative colors of the American flag, with an eye from an African sculpture and an eye from a Black child. San Ernesto de la Higuera. So this is about the death of Che Guevara. And I found these various images of Che Guevara's corpse laying on top of a science table with all of the soldiers and dignitary pointing at him to confirm that he is killed, that he is dead. But they were from different angles, and I decided to choose two and to Photoshop, kind of like combine it and make it look as if a spirit was raising or rising from his body. And of course, in the middle is the patron saint of Cuba. Again, just reaching out to many different people who have died because of their advocacy from all over. I decided to do one on Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, social labor activist, feminist, socialist, so on and so forth. And this speaks to her assassination, where she was beaten and thrown into the river. And then her body resurfaced, all bloated. And I used a photograph of her face bloated after it surfaced from the water, and I use it as a background. So in the blue, it looks almost as if it's an abstraction of patterns. But if you look closely, it's her head in different directions. And in the middle, the Star of David, you know, she was a Jew, which was part of why they hated her as well. And I found this beautiful photograph of her when she was about 14 years old. Paraneda Edgar Sultan, a young woman who was shot dead during a demonstration in Iran after the first election took place, and the dictator that had been running the show all these years won. So people hit the streets in protest. And I did a similar treatment where I incorporated a shot of her head. She was shot down, she fell to the ground, she was bleeding through her nose and her eyes and her ears. And you know, she said, "I can't breathe," and then she died. So that became the backdrop on a green surface. She later became part of the Green movement in Iran. Found this beautiful portrait of her, and I decided to incorporate that in the center piece. And I transfer this image inside of a lotus flower with her name repeated as a background in Arabic. And this was produced on stone tiles. And I put it together. And this in itself became like a shrine piece, which many of my paintings is very much influenced by the shrine. The shrine in Catholic churches, the shrine in the streets, the shrines in our home, so on and so forth. This one is on the assassination of Robert Kennedy, titled The Irish American. This one is the resurrection. It's a resurrection piece, but this time as a model, I use the feet of a woman, which is supposed to represent Christ, who's floating up into this universe where there's an infinity of different faith in that universe. In the bottom part, again, the cry is very consistent. The cry always inside of a circle. It's not a perfect circle, but it's a circle that's supposed to represent infinity, holiness, perfection, cycle, and so on and so forth. But it's not a perfect circle, okay? And then the project that I'm currently working on are on these 12 by 12 inch square panels. And they're all collages of the same images that I've been talking about before. And I created hundreds of these to create a wall installation as well as individual pieces. So I'm usually working on them on a table. Next to that shot is a group of college students, graduate students that came from Hamilton University for a studio visit. And then in the bottom, the installation of the piece in my studio. And on the lower right is the installation of itself. And it's supposed to be a number of floor and wall pieces. But just to run through it, there's other pieces that came out of that project. And then the last thing I want to show and run through it very quickly is, and I'm very happy that this painting was used as an icon, as a image that represents the conference, Art and Education. Enseñar a los niños, teach our children, is one of several paintings that I've done throughout my career, celebrating children and speaking to, we have to take care of our children, we have to educate our children is our future, and so on and so forth. And I shot this photograph of this girl back in 1982, skipping ropes. And I just did a series of montages of the classes that I teach at Hunter College, painting and drawing classes. I do not come to teach my classes with a political agenda. In other words, I avoid as much as possible for my students to know the kind of work that I do. I wanted to teach them how to be creative, how to be intuitive, how to express themselves, whether they're art majors or not, give them techniques, give them concepts, give them exercises, and have them produce a body of work that really speaks to their inner selves, their inner feelings. At the same time, I give them projects that teaches them a lot of techniques in terms of how to use the various media in painting and drawing, but always coming from within themselves. That way they engage in projects that speaks to them in a direct way, and at the same time, like my work, come to discover things about who they are through the assignments. So even though they're all working on the same assignments, they're all very individual expressions. And of course, I give them more academic assignments in terms of, drawing from cast statues and so on and so forth. But again, through self-portraits, through pages from their diary, through conversations, and coming out with lists of things that they say and using it as a subject matter to engage with the assignment, I always felt that that was a way to learn and to use art as a way of speaking their minds. Yes. And I wanted to end it with a family portrait. Back in 2018, my daughter graduated from Teachers College in art education. And I am the first generation that even graduated junior high school and went all the way through college and graduated with a master's degree. And you know, I would hope that when I have a family, our children will be able to do the same, because it was about breaking this ice, of breaking this curse where, you know, and I do come from a family, relatives, cousins, you know, who have fallen into alcoholism, drug abuse. I've had a number of them that have died of overdose. You know, my background is perhaps no different than many of the Puerto Ricans, NeoRicans have gone through in New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. But I was able to break that ice. And I'm so happy and so proud of my daughter, Leona, and her mother. Both of us were born in Brooklyn. We were born in the same hospital, actually the three of us. And the only difference is that Alma's family moved back to Puerto Rico when she was about 5 years old. And then she came back to New York at age 33 to get a degree, a master's degree in theater education. And later she was able to get a PhD in theater education. So anyway, within all the rough and tumbles that life has brought me and to many of us, we were able to succumb, we were able to move forward, we were able to achieve irregardless, you know, because that's who we are. We are people of incredible stamina and resistance and resilience. And unfortunately, it wasn't all of us, but many of us. And of course, those of us that are here have had the kind of challenges and achievement as I have, you know. I made my daughter's life a little easier, just as my parents made my life a bit easier, and so on and so forth, you know. But that's
sorry to interrupt you, but
that's okay. I'm gonna. This is the ending of my talk. You know, we're in a way we're superhuman, you know, and so I created this Puerto Rican super shield, and I shared a joke earlier about the green glow around it, and some cynic once said, "Oh, but that's kryptonite," you know, and I said, "No, that's not kryptonite. That's la verde luz, you know, the light of hope, you know." And I'll end it right there. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Juan. I have a few questions for you. You know, well, I'm going to be selfish and take a moment to say, I didn't know that your use of reconstruction was from this Rey Barreto album. And that's a phrase, a concept really that I've been thinking with a lot for all my life, but particularly after Hurricane Maria. You know, what does it mean to reconstruct, and how can we reimagine so that it's not just building back to, you know, what we have, but like a different kind of construction. Do you have any thoughts about, you know, what I know your work is so, you know, is so embedded in a particular place and time, and its engagement with the young lords, with Albizu Campos, etc. How are you engaging with politics in Puerto Rico now and the kind of reconstruction that is happening now?
I think it's all connected, and because of the consistency throughout the years, this recent project that I've been working on for the past 5 years with the panels, the individual panels to make these wall and floor installation, plus the individual pieces, which is composed of 4 panels, which is like a T shape pieces. They're all being created with the events and the reality that we're living now. I mean, there are times where I address certain issues directly. In another presentation, I showed a series of photographs of the demonstrations that hosted out the governor of Puerto Rico, which was amazing. So it really speaks about, you know, this younger generation that when they have to hit the street, they hit the street, and they're achieving a lot, you know. And there's this younger generation of artists and musicians and theater and dance, you know, that, you know, are manifesting themselves in ways that speaks to the issues, the concerns going on in Puerto Rico and going on within the Puerto Rican diaspora. So I take that as inspiration to the work that I'm doing now. And I'm trying to find ways of how to bring these events and these kinds of things, like the earlier works, into my present work.
Awesome. There's a question from Anthony Torres. He would like to know more about the influence of religion and spirituality in your work. And he also wonders if you offer any community workshops or teaching and training opportunities outside of the classroom.
Well, I appreciate the question. I don't know if I'm a very religious person, although, you know, I am a born-again Christian, and we were raised as Catholics. So I went through, you know, the first communion, the first confirmation. I went to religious instruction school, classes after school when I was in the 6th grade. You know, we were a Catholic family, you know. Within that Catholicism, there was also elements of spiritualism, and through other aunts and uncles, Santeria. So I was taking all of that in, you know, and that has found its way into my work. So it does speak about those things as an embracement, and at the same time as a criticism because of, you know, colonialism. You know, I mean, they came in with the blessings and the support of the Catholic Church, and they killed a lot of people. They killed a lot of indigenous people. They found a way to justify, you know, slavery, and on and on and on. So I'm very aware and I'm very angered, but at the same time, you know, it's like these people weren't really following, you know, or at least their reading of the text. They read it with a different perspective to justify their evil ways, you know. And of course, I was always presented, which I've used in my paintings, the white Christ, you know, which that in itself is not true. Mm-hmm. So there's this pushing and pulling, you know, this yin yang in terms of how these iconography are represented in my work. And because of that experience, there's a lot of contradictions that surface through the work. And I'm comfortable with that. The work is not about my saying this is what it is, but to present certain things. Of course, I believe in a lot of it and open it up for discussion and conversation. I use it as a stimulus. I do a lot of workshops. Whenever I'm invited, community centers, people who are teaching a class in their school or in their high school or whatever, they invite me to come and talk to their class. I'll go and talk to their class, you know, and I do it we don't have conversations about money or anything like that. You know, this is something that I do is a duty to share my art, to share this talent that I am blessed with young kids. And I'll go in and I'll do a workshop, whether it's in a school or in a community center or whatever. So I'm always open to that. So in a way, I overextend beyond the graduates and the undergraduate classes that I do at Hunter College. I always welcome it, and it's just a question of figuring out when is it possible. Sometimes the schedule doesn't allow, but I'm open and I'm very free to engage with various communities.
On the question of education, Juan, I wanted to ask you, you formally trained. What do you think, you learned a lot about tradition, artistic tradition. You went to school at a time when there wasn't, such conversations about decolonial art. Like you had to pioneer the decolonization of the art world. What did that entail? What did you have to unlearn in your practice?
Well, it's not so much about unlearning. I mean, I went to 2 prestigious art schools. Okay, I went to Cooper Union, and then later on, I did graduate work at the Mason Grove School of the Arts. All the art schools are very Eurocentric, and that's what they teach. Things are opening up now because students are hitting them hard to decolonize, the curriculum, and to have professors decolonize their syllabus and so on and so forth. But back then, the only thing that I had access to, and I'm talking about 1973, when I was in Cooper Union through 77, pre-Columbian art and African art, nothing relative to contemporary or modern African art or Latin American art or whatever, If there was some coverage of the Latin American art, it was Mexican muralists, which I more than welcome. That influenced my earlier work. I was creating these large mural-like paintings dealing with Puerto Rico and my identity. But I was desperate. I was hungry for information outside of what the art schools offered. So I took in what they gave me and I learned a lot from it. But at the same time, thanks to an art history teacher, a Cuban by the name of Nelita de Villan, who was teaching pre-Columbian art. She visited my studio, she looked at my work, and she was kind of impressed with it, but at the same time, she said, your work is very strong. I don't necessarily agree with your politics, but you're very serious artist. And then she turned me on to El Museo del Barrio, which was back in 1974. And she gave me the address, and she said, you should go there. I think you're gonna appreciate it. And it's the first time that I visited El Museo del Barrio, Puerto Rican museum. First time I've seen Puerto Rican art, be they paintings or lithographs or woodcuts or whatever. Art from the island. I got introduced to Minna Valles and Lorenzo Mal and Rafael Tufino and a host of others. And I was introduced to the artist collective, Tael Boricua. And the first person that I met was Gilberto Hernandez, who was working at El Museo, talked to me about El Tael Boricua, gave me the address. I went to El Tael Boricua that same day. And the person who opened the door is Jorge Soto Sanchez. And I told him that I was an art student from Cooper Union and that Gil sent me over. So he let me in, and that was their workshop. That was their artist collective place. He showed me around. He showed me his paintings, his drawings. He showed me the silkscreen shop. Other artists started coming in, like Rafael Colón Morales and a host of others. And we spent the day there. They embraced me. They showed me stuff. We had combative conversations. We collected quarters and dimes, got some wine and food, and we spent the whole day. So I ended up leaving in Puerto Rico around 2 a.m. in the morning. So I had to get back to Brooklyn, take a shower, and get ready for my 9 o'clock morning class. So being exposed to that through El Museo, finding out about the founding of the Studio Museum in Harlem, visiting the Studio Museum, I came across this book by Samuela Lewis on contemporary African-American art. That's when I got introduced to Faith Wango and Melvin Edwards and a host of others. Melvin Edwards was my professor at Rutgers University, so was Leon Gala. So all of that was happening, and yet there weren't books, you know, there weren't the kind of proliferation of information that we're getting on now, which is really the result of that beginning, right? I don't think that if they were in a Museo del Barrio or a Cayman Gallery, you know, or the various, you know, art centers and museums that open, you know, in by Chicano artists, all, you know, it's almost as if that became the seed to what we have now, including El Centro. I mean, the people that fought for that were college students, you know. They fought for that in Hunter College. They fought for a Department of Puerto Rican and Black Studies in Brooklyn College, and so on and so forth. So I was kind of like at the beginning of all of that, you know, but the way things started to proliferate, and also the bookstores, one bookstore that I visited on 14th Street, which was run by the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. And that's where I got all the poetry books by Julia, Clemente Soto Vélez, Antonio Corregel. That's where I got all the recordings from by Roy Brown and other groups in the independence movement. That was also a place where I was also, you know, reading their newspaper and all of that. So 73, 74, 5, there was nothing, and yet what few was out there was a lot for me.
But I feel like you're saying that, you know, what helped you decolonize was community, right? The engagement with these other communities. And I think it's reflective in your work too. One other question I had for you, you know, I feel like so much of what inspired you was your life in the streets of Brooklyn and the streets of New York, what you saw around you on the subway, etc. How do you feel now navigating New York? Do you still feel that you're in this NeoRican space, or how has it changed for you?
I still feel that I am, because you know, I am living in Williamsburg. I'm living in lo que se llama Los Sures, where there's a dominant Puerto Rican, Dominican, you know, as well as Central American artists living there, you know. And I have great pleasure, I have great joy whenever I step out of my apartment to the corner bodega or dry cleaners or whatever, you know, and just step out and say hello to people and go into the stores and order whatever I want, and all in Spanish, you know. I don't know, I just feel an incredible sense of fulfillment, you know, and love and appreciation. It's one of those things where, irregardless of whatever happens to me on the economic front, this is not a place that I want to abandon, never have abandoned, never had that mentality that, you know, I want to get out of the ghetto, you know. What I want to do is I wanted to get out of the ghetto mentality. I want our people to get out of that ghetto mentality, you know, but this is my community. This is where I live. And so even though I'm traveling quite a bit and exhibiting in museums and whatnot, those are just moments for me to spread the word and to inform people and to talk to people about our reality, not only in terms of the struggle, but also who we are with all the joys and all the celebration and all the virtues of our people. So I feel like I have a lot of company. You know, my library is packed with so many books as of late in the last 10 years or so, books written by many of us. I nurture from that. These are writers. These are people that are half my age, you know, and I nurture from that, you know. So in a way, I'm always stepping out, but I'm always coming back because I need to be back. I need to be in that environment. My studio is in a different part of Brooklyn. It's in Dumbo, somewhat isolated from my community. But I go in, I lock myself up, I work, and then I go back to Williamsburg and spend the evenings and the weekends there and interacting with the people in the community, despite the fact that we're also going through regentrification.
Yeah, I guess that's why I was most curious about, you know, some of what you describe about, you know, walking down the street with the young lords selling their newspapers, and it just feels like a kind of a different moment, that certainly from the one that I live in Fort Greene, not far from you or from your studio. To me, you know, even though I feel like New York City is the best place to be Puerto Rican in the U.S., from my perspective, having moved recently, I feel a sense of nostalgia for a different era that I didn't experience myself.
Well, you know, what's kind of interesting though is that back then, and it's not like you had young lords, you know, distributing their Palante newspaper in every corner of my neighborhood or in barrio. They were out there and they were doing what they're doing, right? And the young lords has an incredible history in terms of their manifestation in El Barrio in East Harlem. But one thing that I realized is that with some of that activity going on, and of course the neighborhood being so active and so present, you know, that was going on in the outside, but in the inside, there was still a lot of questions. There was still a lot of ambiguity. Many my own. That's why I got into making this art, because I want to find out more about who are my parents, you know, what is Puerto Rico? You know, the last time I was in Puerto Rico back then, I was like 7 years old one summer, and then I never came back until I was 27, you know? So, you know, there was that activity in the community and that liveliness and whatnot. But one thing that I noticed is that what proliferated from there is now interior. You know, whereas people living in those very community, that very environment, still had a lot of question marks as to who they are and why they are. Now, maybe the street is not full of Puerto Rican flags. Even in El Barrio, that was like all over the place. You still have blocks with Puerto Rican flags floating, but not as many as before. But I feel that every time I come across young people, they have some notion, they have some proximity to who they are, and a lot of pride, you know? I mean, I lived in an era where I was constantly hammered with being less than, and that we don't have culture. And we're just people who need to stop speaking Spanish and go into English and assimilate if we were to succeed. Of course, all of that was false, you know, and the American dream became the American, you know, with a K, nightmare, and we lived through that. So we're so aware of it. But my God, the proliferation of younger people, you know, coming out of hip hop and so on and so forth, manifesting their Ricanness, they reinvaded those communities. And so I kind of feel that now, even though I kind of miss that kind of environment, but we were kind of like living in a void. Now that void is being filled within us. You know, it was our spirit, it was our consciousness that we needed to work on. And I think that work is being done now. You know, not to say that it's all done. We still have a long way to go. Each generation is born, how we're going to educate them, so on and so forth. But I feel that there's more a level of consciousness and self-awareness among a larger body of people in contrast to before, during the time that I was, you know, a young person.
That's so beautiful, Juan. Thank you. And I think I have to say, I feel such an honor to be in dialogue with you and to be directing El Centro, which is an organization that was born through the struggle of, you know, folks of your generation. And I want to think that maybe, you know, some of those flags that used to wave on the street corners now, you know, we preserve them in our library and archive. And I think coming out of the National Puerto Rican Day Parade that was just last week, and we saw, you know, that pride, that celebration, you know, that spirit is definitely still within us. So thank you so much for your generosity of time and spirit, your beautiful art, your constant engagement with your history, your culture, your community. We thank you. And I just want to say to everyone watching, well, we're going to take a little break from the program, but we will be back at 1 p.m. with the panel Creating from Zero. The jornada continues. Thank you so much, Juan. I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Same here. And thank you and El Centro for organizing this. Unfortunately, because of my ridiculous schedule, I haven't been able to catch up with the conference, but I read the program and it's amazing. And it's like my fault. I'm missing out on this. But again, this is an example of what I was talking about, you know, and people attending these conferences and sharing and learning from each other, and then going out into the field and doing the work. So I really appreciate that. And hopefully those of you that are here, I know, and others I don't quite know, but I really hope that at some point we could have an in-person encounter down the line.
We will. Gracias, Juan. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.